Good morning. Good afternoon. Happy Monday. Thought I'd start your week off with a huge smile. Hope you guys had a good weekend. We're starting a new style of course. As you guys know, we're going to switch to, you're going to have review lecture for content. We're also going to do skills during live Zoom classes starting today. So this you will be watching probably after we've already had our class on DBQ skills. Today we're moving on to period 5, the last period that is on your AP exam. We've covered post-classical trade, we've covered the spread of Islam, we've covered post-classical states like the Mongols, we've covered early modern gunpowder empires. We've covered changes to trade in the early modern empire. We've covered early modern maritime empires. We've covered the Columbian Exchange and motivations for European exploration. We've covered the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and the British and the French. We've covered the Atlantic system. And now we're moving on to modern era. So over the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about Enlightenment, revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, imperialism, reactions to imperialism, and global migration of the modern era. So a lot to cover content-wise, but it's all stuff you guys have learned. So it should be review. It should be really familiar. Can't implore enough how much you guys should be studying. If you're not studying, you're not going to pass the exam. I'm going to say that in class every day, but I'm going to say it in the video every day too. If you're not doing extra studying outside of the time we have class, you're not going to pass the exam. It's just, you have to be studying. You have to be memorizing key terms that go with every topic that we've studied. I'm going to just keep saying that. And if you don't do it, you're not going to pass. And I don't know what to do about that. All right, so today we're going to dive into Enlightenment. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get started. The early modern period begins talking about the Enlightenment and then the revolutions that stem from these new Enlightenment ideas. Before we do that, I just wanted to do a quick review of what the world looks like in 1750. So what's going on in the world in 1750? And this would be a great exercise for you to try first. Can you hit pause on the video? So after I kind of present the question, I would pause the video and think, what's happening in every part of the world in 1750? More or less, what empires are in control? Who's doing what in 1750? So pause the video, see if you can do that. Okay, welcome back. So the world in 1750 looks a little like this. The European maritime empires have arisen. They are in full stride. They are powerful. They are engaged in an economic system known as mercantilism. These European maritime empires want colonies abroad. They want colonies in the Americas. They want colonies in Asia. And from those colonies, they want to get raw materials. They want to get precious metals like gold and silver. They want to get food. It could be food like sugar, but also they want things like corn and wheat and any kinds of productive food, fruit. And they want raw materials. Raw materials could be bat guano for fertilizer. It could be lumber. It could be the cash crops could be considered raw material. Mineral resources, furs, all kinds of things. And so the European powers want to extract these wealth items from their colonies, manufacture them, and then sell them back to their colonies. This is kind of imperialism version 1. is known as mercantilism. The European colonies are especially interested by 1750 in acquiring tea, acquiring sugar, and both of those things they need to get from outside of Europe. They need to get those things from the Americas and from India and China. They're engaged in global trade. They're connected to South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia via maritime trade routes around the Horn of Africa into the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific. They can sail all the way from Mexico to China in their galleons. So Europeans are engaged in these incredible maritime empires. They have trade posts. They try to monopolize trade, all stuff that we've covered in previous lectures. They're also in control of the Americas, fully in control of the Americas by this point. Europeans control all of the Americas. They've established plantation agriculture throughout the Americas to grow cotton, sugar, tobacco. Those are the big plantation: cotton, sugar, tobacco, the three main cash crops. And they're engaged in the Atlantic system. So Europeans are enslaving millions of Africans, tens of thousands every month, hundreds of thousands every year during this time. This is like the peak of the transatlantic slave trade, 1750. At the same time, there are some very powerful European Asian-based land empires, excuse me. You have the Mughals. That's the center video, the center image. The Mughals are in control of South Asia. They've conquered the Hindus, but they engage in religious tolerance. You also have the Ottomans, who have conquered much of West Asia and North Africa, basically all the territory that was once conquered by the Umayyad and Abbasids, now the Ottomans control. They control a lot of Eastern Europe as well, Greece, the Balkans. Much of Eastern Europe is controlled by the Ottomans. The Ottomans are a huge empire in 1750. The Mughals are a huge empire in 1750. We also have the Qing in China in 1750. Very powerful Qing Empire. They think that they are the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, just like their predecessors, the Ming, thought about themselves. And then Russia has expanded a lot by 1750. Russia has conquered most of Siberia. And the European maritime empires are starting to make inroads in India. They're starting to, bit by bit, get control of territory in India, taking it away from the Mughals. They're not making so much headway against the Ottomans yet, but definitely taking territory from the Mughals. And you remember they're going to start taking control of East Asia pretty soon too, by the 1830s and 1840s with the Opium Wars. Europe is going to be in firm control of East Asia. The political systems that govern all of these empires are absolute monarchies. Divine rule is the only political system that exists in 1750. Every single entity, every single part of the globe is controlled by a king or a queen in some way, shape, or form. This has been true. Divine rule has been the go-to political system since the first civilizations founded in the ancient era. It is the basic form of governance chosen, you could say, by humans, basically since the first civilizations, going back to Mohenjo-Daro and Babylon. And divine rule is belief in some kind of absolute monarch, and that monarch believes he or she has direct connection to God or is a God directly. And it's true in every single empire I just mentioned. We see here the Qing Emperor, the Qinglong Emperor. We see Suleiman the Magnificent in the center, the Ottoman Emperor, at the peak of the Ottoman Empire. Henry VIII, Louis XIV, And all of these divine rulers controlled much of the wealth of the state. The state, much of its income went to supporting these divine rulers, their vast, huge palaces, their clothes, their families, their extended families, their cousins, and they were the state. That's what Louis XIV's famous phrase is: I am the state. I am the government. It all resides in me. As George W. Bush would say, I am the decider. Louis XIV was the decider of everything. And this is true literally in all parts of the world. And it's important to remember this because we can't understand why the Enlightenment is such a big deal, why it's so revolutionary, unless we compare it to what existed before, what the status quo was. And the status quo was divine rule with absolute monarchy. And in all of these societies, every society that had divine rule had some kind of hierarchical structure that looked like feudalism, with a king or an emperor at the top, followed by lords and nobles. So these lords and nobles often shared almost as much power as the king. The king is only one person, or the queen is only one person, and he or she are located in their palace. And yes, they might make the final decisions on a lot of big things, but the lords have the power on the ground, and the lords considered themselves like mini kings and mini queens. And they thought everyone below them was certainly not equal, certainly not on the same uh, social or economic spectrum. And I think in many cases, these nobles thought of people below them as second-class humans, like not actually as evolved in a way that we see in social Darwinism later. So the nobles have a ton of power. The church has a ton of power because in all these societies, there's a lot of connection between the king and the divine. So the king and the queen are always working very closely with the high priests, with the pope, with the in the Ottoman Empire, it would have been with the Muslim religious leaders. In the Mughal Empire, it would have been the emperor would have been very closely associated with his religious leaders, the religious leaders within his both Hindu and Muslim inside of South Asia. So there's always a close connection between the king and the religious hierarchy. And then everyone else is kind of at the bottom, and they're pretty poor, not close in economic or political status to the king and the nobles. So a feudalistic society exists in all of these empires in which divine rule is the form of government and absolute monarchy is the form of government. We looked last, when we introduced this, at some of the rights of lords to kind of show the kind of power that they had over peasants. And they truly had absolute power over peasants. We looked at one of these, one of the rights of lords, and these are taken from Europe, medieval Europe, was the right to ravage. The right to ravage, which is the right of the lord to devastate the fields in his domain. So to take anything he wants from the peasants. Any crops he wants, if he wants to ride his horses through a farmer's field and destroy his farmer's crops, he can do that. The farmers and the peasants have no rights against the Lord. The Lord can basically do whatever he wants to the fields. There's also a famous, not often used, but still I think a noteworthy example of the right of first night, prima nocta. And this is when the Lord had the right to bed the wife of any peasant in his domain on the night of the wedding. Again, this is an egregious assertion of your right as a lord over your peasants, but basically the right to rape any woman in his domain on the night of the wedding. It's kind of hard to imagine, but this was a legal doctrine that existed in some parts of Europe. This one is kind of the most outlandish. Historians have kind of confirmed that it did exist. I'm sure it wasn't used very often, but I think it's also a great example just of how much power these lords and absolute monarchs had over the peasantry. The droit de prélassement was when the lord had the right to disembowel, as in cut open the belly of his serfs or peasants to warm his feet. So if my feet are cold and you are a peasant walking by and I decide your life is not as valuable as the warmth of my feet, I could cut open your stomach and warm my cold toes in your warm guts. Uh, Hard to think about, but these three rights of lords show what the status quo was like. That's how much power lords had over peasants. That's how much power kings had over lords. And that's the way the world worked. So what's so remarkable about the Enlightenment is that this status quo gets completely undone. So we're going to go through the Enlightenment ideas, and then you're going to think about why these are so revolutionary. Before we get into the Enlightenment ideas themselves, it's important to remember that the Enlightenment ideas grow from a long history of empiricism. This is studying the way the world works using observation to make conclusions about the world. It's not just doing what your king or your priest or pope or imam says to you. It's observing the world yourself and making some conclusions for yourself. So scientists like Galileo, like Descartes, like Copernicus were observing the world, and they were starting to come up with some theories about how the world worked, about some of the foundations of science that we know today. And those observations were in contradiction with what the religious leaders were telling people about how the world worked, or about how the world was formed, or about how physics worked. And so these scientists and philosophers are starting to make observations, and this is known as empiricism. And empiricism, in many ways, leads to the Enlightenment ideas. And both empiricism challenges the status quo of religion, essentially, of being told by someone else how the world works, and you take that as truth without questioning it yourself. And the Enlightenment challenges the status quo of divine right, of absolute monarchy. The first one you guys all know well, and I'll quiz you on these this week, but natural rights, John Locke. Natural rights are that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and property, and that the government has the duty, it is the government's job to protect those rights. That is the government's sole responsibility, is to protect my right to life, my right to liberty, and my right to property. Property is sacred. If you own some land, no one should be able to take that land from you without just cause. This happened all the time in medieval Europe. It happened all the time in all of these empires. A lord or a king could just take land when they wanted to. So protection of private property is super important. Protection of life is important. You can't kill me without putting me on trial, without giving me a reason why you think I should be killed. Protecting life. And government job is supposed to do that. That's what governments are supposed to do. And the right to freedom, the right to liberty, to not be enslaved, to not be controlled by someone else, to have your own free will and determine what you want to do with your life. Those are the natural rights proposed by John Locke. We also talked about the social contract. Now, the social contract is from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the social contract is basically an equation that if we take John Locke's idea that we're all born with natural rights, we're all born free, it means anyone could basically do whatever they want. They could have free choice to do what they want. You can't kill somebody, that would violate their right to life. You can't just take someone's stuff, that would violate their right to property. But you would have a society that might be pretty chaotic with just a lot of individuals running amok, doing free will, doing what they want. And Rousseau kind of came up with this idea that says the social contract, that we're going to give up some of our natural rights in order to form civil society. So we're going to agree to some laws, and those laws are going to limit our freedoms. They're going to limit our freedoms. We're not allowed to just like blaze down the street at 100 miles an hour if we want. On my bike commute, I'm not allowed to just blow through every stop sign and every stoplight. So there are rules that I agree to follow. I agree to give up my right to just ride my bike however I want in order to live in a society that functions more safely for everybody. This is known as the social contract. The other idea that Rousseau brings up that I think is kind of the more well-known and easier to remember is the idea of popular sovereignty, that people should choose their own government. If the government's job is to protect our rights, we should decide what government that is, what government we want. People are the only source of government. Power of the government is given to the government by the people. Power is received from the people. So how do people choose their own government? This is where we get the idea of democracy, of elections. If people are going to choose their own government, if they have that right, according to popular sovereignty, how will they choose their government? Most often, we see in world history, it's through elections. People choose their government through elections. That is the expression of popular sovereignty. Montesquieu, the next major philosopher who came up with the idea of separation of powers. Montesquieu was very bothered by the fact that a king could make laws, a king could decide whether those laws were violated or not, and then the king could execute a trial and execute those laws. So he proposed the separation of powers, that there should be one group that creates the laws, the legislature. There should be one group that enforces the laws, the executive, and there should be one group that decides whether laws have been broken or not, whether laws are constitutional or not, whether laws are fair or not, and that is the judicial branch. So those are the three branches that Montesquieu came up with: legislative, judicial, executive, which we know very well because those are the three branches of our government. But you can imagine how corrupt the world would be if the king can make a law. The king could make a law and say, okay, I'm making a new law that everyone has to hop on one foot if they want to speak with me. And if you don't hop on one foot when you want to speak with me, then I will cut off your other foot to make sure that you hop on only one foot when you speak with me. And then the king could decide, well, that guy was kind of hopping, but I don't think he was hopping high enough, so I'm going to cut off his foot because he's not hopping high enough, and that'll help him hop higher. So I'm going to create the law, I'm going to enforce the law, and then I'm going to decide whether or not you broke the law. That's all the power in one person. That's absolute monarchy. That's the kind of power that kings and emperors had. And Montesquieu questioned that. He said, we need to separate all those powers into different groups of people so that they can keep checks on each other. This is the idea of checks and balances. They're going to keep checks on each other. And the last philosopher we're going to talk today about is Voltaire. Voltaire was very critical of the Christian religion. He thought that, especially that the Catholic Church was extremely corrupt in kind of brainwashing people, but also in stealing their money. And Voltaire promoted something known as religious tolerance, that everyone should have the right to choose their own religion, and no one should be persecuted or bothered based on their religion. And Voltaire also was a leader for this idea of free speech, that anyone should be able to say what they want and not be punished for it. That if you have a solid government, you should be able to withstand the criticism, the written criticism of any critic. If your government is serving the people, then criticism is fine. You can handle it. And these ideas of freedom of speech and religious tolerance are hugely different than the status quo in 1750. I mean, these are tremendously different ideas where you're allowed to question what the church tells you. You're allowed to question the nature of God or the nature of science. You're allowed to question the policies of a king or a queen or a lord or a priest. And that never happened before. Certainly not by people who wanted to stay alive for very long. So these are huge ideas that you could have religious tolerance and express yourself without fear of punishment. So the question is, again, why are these ideas so revolutionary? What makes them so special and so unique? And the answer to that question is that because these Enlightenment ideas challenged absolute rule. They challenged absolute political rule, and they challenged absolute religious dogma. And powerful religion and powerful emperors and kings and queens have been in power. That's a lot of power, as I just said. But they've been in control since the dawn of human civilization. So, and they've had incredible power over the people who don't have that power, the peasants, the workers, anyone who's of a lower economic status. And these Enlightenment ideas challenge their power. And that is going to be troublesome. They are not going to want to give up their power. They're not going to want to share their power with people who choose their own representatives. They're not going to want to allow people to start their own sects of a church and say, well, you told me the Bible is like this or the Quran is like this, but I actually want to start my own religion. This is how I interpret the Bible. This is how I interpret the Quran. I'm gonna start my own religion, I think. An interpretation of the Bible that I think is more accurate than the one that you're giving me. So these ideas truly upend much of the world and lead to revolutions. And these revolutions are what we're going to look at tomorrow. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the Latin American Revolution. So keep thinking on why Enlightenment is so remarkable, why these ideas are so remarkable, why they're so different from the status quo. And we'll look at the different revolutions tomorrow. All right. Thanks for paying attention. Thanks for staying with me, and see you tomorrow.